vellum because of just the expense of the materials. So only 25 of those were vellum.
Mm-hmm.
And the 275 intended to be bound up in leather, and then the rest, the rest will be in the trade cloth edition. So usually the vellum and the leather are much more limited in scope, and then we print the majority of them in the cloth so that libraries and individuals who are on a budget can afford them.
Mm-hmm. And that has really worked out. I mean, the Picatrix has already sold out in cloth, correct?
Yeah, the cloth edition sold out recently, and I guess it's not too surprising, but the prices on the used market have just sort of shot through the roof, and how far they've shot through the roof, I think, is surprising. But
especially when there are still leather versions available, right?
Yeah, that's the funny thing. You can get a leather version direct from me for a lot less than what the cloth versions are going for on the used market right now. Well,
that I guess people just don't know that you're out there doing this still. So
I'm just hermited away in my little log cabin, scribing these tomes out.
And what's the next one after the Turbo Philosophorum?
Well, we finally received the complete translation of the second volume of the Picatrix, and so it's in the editorial phase now, and we're really excited. That's going to be an important second volume.
Mm-hmm.
So that'll be the next one, and we've got a natural history of dragons, which is an English translation of the Dragonibus by Athanasius Kircher, who was a Renaissance Jesuit polymath, and also currently working on a English translation from the Latin of Iocus Severus, which is the serious game by Michael Meyer, who was the Emperor Rudolph II's alchemist.
Excellent. Now, you also are selling The God of Socrates. Heptangle Books is no longer around, but you're helping sell off the remaining stock. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, there's still several copies of the last Heptangle Books book available, and it's The God of Socrates. It was the last work that Daniel Driscoll printed before he passed away, and Joel Radcliffe of Ars Obscura had acquired these copies and bound them up, and all of his other works are long out of print and just commanding high prices on the market. And
mm-hmm.
This is kind of a gem. It's a little more scholarly than some of the other works he'd done. Still nicely printed. It's letterpress printed, and just a little jewel of a book about the higher genius. It's written by Apelius, who wrote The Golden Ass, and I was always a fan of Heptangle Press, and so for me, just distributing this book, it's kind of an honor. I like to focus following in their footsteps.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, you've offered to give a copy of the Turbo Philosophorum in the cloth edition to one of the Thelema Coast to Coast listeners. So if anybody listening to this is interested in getting a copy, all you need to do is email your mailing address to podcast@thelemacoasttocoast.com. The deadline for mailing that is July 15th, and that's midnight on July 15th Eastern Time. And after that, one person will be chosen and the book sent to them. And this is open to international listeners also, not just domestic within the United States. So if you're interested in attempting to win a copy of the Turbo Philosophorum, Turba Philosophorum, send in your email, or send in the email with your mailing address. And William, is there anything else that you'd like people to know about the Ouroboros Press and kind of what you're doing and so forth?
Yeah, we're going to have a book release party for the Turbo Philosophorum in New York on July 8th.
All right.
Sunday, July 8th at 8 p.m., and that's going to take place at the Stone, which is John Zorn's avant-garde music club, which is on Avenue C and 2nd Street. And I'm going to be giving a presentation on the alchemical bestiary, which is going to discuss animal symbolism in alchemy and particularly in its emblems. And there'll be a slideshow of rare books and manuscripts showing these symbols. So I'll be there. I'll be giving the talk, and I'll have all my books there. And so if you're in the New York area on the 8th of July, come by and say hi.
Fantastic. Now, if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, how would they do so?
Well, you can reach me through my website, which is www.bookarts.org, or you can email me direct at ouroboros@bookarts.org. That's OUROBOROS.
All right, and I will have a link to the website on the podcast website.
Great, right. Thanks, John.
Well, thanks for being on the show. Is there anything else you'd like people to know?
I think that's it. I appreciate having the opportunity to be on Thelema Coast to Coast.
Well, this is fantastic. I really love the things that you're doing. I've seen a copy of the Picatrix, and it's just a phenomenal job that you've done. So, I'm sure the winner of the Turbo Philosophorum will love it, and I'm sure those who have the first volume of the Picatrix are looking forward to seeing Volume 2. Now, is there only going to be 2 volumes in the end, or are there multiple volumes?
Yeah, the second volume will be the completed work. It has the final 2 books of the Picatrix.
All right. Sounds good. Well, thanks again for being on the show. 93.
Thanks a lot, John. 93.
Thanks to William for being on the show, and thanks again for the offer to one listener to win a copy of the Turbo Philosophorum. Again, send your name and your full address to podcast@thelemacoasttocoast.com. The deadline for entry is 12 midnight on the 15th of July, 2007. So, send you that over, and it is open to international listeners also. The next interview is with Keith 418. Most people have listened to the podcast before and are familiar with him. He and I get into and discuss the Hegelian master and slave relationship, as well as its relationship to Thelema. And we have a very interesting conversation. So here it is. Keith, welcome back to the podcast, 93.
93, John. Thanks for having me.
Recently on your blog, you've been writing about a philosopher named Kojève and his take on Hegel. In particular, you've been concentrating on looking at the Hegelian ideas behind master and slave, Kojève's discussion of that, and comparing that to Crowley and Crowley's ideas of masters and slaves and Thelema. I guess for people that aren't aware, can you give a quick summary about how Hegel sees the master-slave relationship?
Well, Hegel sees a dialectical process happening where the master and slave relationship starts when the master proves that he is sort of more than human by being able to risk death in his objectives. And the slave can't bring himself to risk death. So the master actually kind of rises above the natural environment and imposes his will on it and achieves a sort of state of mastery through his willingness to risk death, and then proceeds to enslave the slave who works for him and doesn't want to risk death. And this relationship and the relationship between the masters sets up the paradigm for the ancient world, the pre-Christian or pagan world. And as that society becomes self-conscious, it produces tragic art because it sees certain conflicts as being irreconcilable. And those irreconcilable conflicts which beset it produce tragic art. Christianity is one of a number of ideologies that the slave kind of comes up with to overcome their slave state. And Hegel defines these ideologies as ways of looking at the possibility of freedom. And the slave moves through various ideologies in classical thinking to Christianity. So I thought this was fascinating, given the fact that as a sort of post-Christian pagan in a lot of ways, Crowley reintroduces the master-slave relationship. And one of the chapters in Magic Without Tears, which ironically is one of these books where Crowley actually explains his system very simply, and yet the current OTO has allowed it to go out of print. It's not a book that very many people cite very frequently in the Thelema community, unfortunately. I mean, you and I seem obsessed with it, but very few other people seem to pay too much attention to it. In one of those chapters, as you know, he lays out why the morality of Liber Al is very hard to accept, and why we have to anyway. And he lays out certain definitions about what the human relationships are as defined in his thinking. And he reasserts the master-slave dichotomy very, very explicitly. And I find it fascinating that so many people in the occult community, especially in the OTO, really resist looking at this. I mean, you never hear them talk about the slave gods or slavish behavior, slave mentality, or what distinguishes a master from a slave. And in a lot of ways, there's a great deal of hostility towards anything that's not egalitarian in the Thelemic community. So the idea that Crowley is explicitly saying that this dichotomy exists in human relationships is something that the people in the OTO don't want to hear. I mean, a friend of mine said no one wants to read Magic Without Tears because it keeps telling the Thelema community and the OTO things they do not want to hear. And, reiterating the master-slave relationship as being part of, human relations is definitely something people don't want to hear. So, Hegel looked at this process and said that there's a struggle whereby through Christianity, slaves and masters sort of merge into one class, which is the bourgeoisie. And they're slaves without masters, and that the bourgeoisie don't work directly for a group of other people, and masters without slaves, and that the bourgeoisie really don't have a class of people under them that they're constantly bossing around. Instead, they have this sort of abstract relation to capital. And people can think about, their relationship to their IRA, or sort of where their money is kept, and the idea of accumulating capital. It's this sort of abstract situation that they relate to, and of course this is picked up later by Marx. And one of your guests has been on the show before, T. Allen Greenfield, has often pointed out that Crowley got a lot of his ideas for the OTO from Hegel, and I didn't believe that. I didn't pay too much attention to it until I went and started studying Hegel, and I found out that Allen Greenfield was right about that. He really did get, I think, some of these ideas from that. So, we're looking back at this now and saying, well, what kind of relationship are we going to have in a Thelemic community between masters and slaves, and how are we going to look at how masters are defined and how slaves are defined, and what the relationship is going to be coming away from that?
Well, one of the things that I think is very interesting about this relationship is a lot of the people that have anxiety about the discussion of masters and slaves think that the masters are somehow going to enslave others. That there's going to be some kind of violent oppression that one person is going to exert on another to enslave them. Reminiscent of the African slaves and things in the past that most people object to. But I think what's important to point out is that that's not the case at all, that the masters are going to self-select by their willing to take risks, and that the slaves are going to self-select by their willing to not take risks, to take the safe course. And therefore, people come to their own equilibrium, and it's not one person enslaving another.
Well, I don't know if that's really going to be the case, John. I mean, I can't say that for sure. In fact, I think some of the tests that go on in terms of self-selecting process come about through crises, where you're faced with certain questions about how you're going to behave, and that those crises are brought on at the instigation of other people. So that the idea that it's going to be a sort of self-selecting process that goes on naturally without other human beings being involved in the process, I wouldn't go so far as to say that, because I think that those crises and that relationship is actually part of the self-selecting process.
Well, again, I'm not saying that other people aren't going to be involved. I'm saying that you're not going to have roving bands of people grabbing others and enslaving them and